Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So it is that time of the year, time to do our, well, twice yearly ranking series. December is here, and here in front of you is the schedule in what order we are going to be going over all of the different champion ranking videos. And as we can see, we are going to start with 2020 buffed champions. Now, before we get any further, again, it is important for you guys to remember, this is my opinion and my opinion only. I do not have solid data to break down. I don't work for Kabam. And ultimately, I do try to make these as objective as possible. There are specific criteria that I'm trying to use rather than just my personal opinion or feelings about these champions. And in case of buffed champions, ultimately, the most important thing, in my opinion, that determines whether a buff has been successful or not is whether that champion is seeing the catalyst, the daylight, whether we see videos being made about those champions a couple months after they have been buffed, whether we see those champions being used in battleground decks or clearing more important piece of content. And this is not also something that anybody should try to refute anecdotally. I'm sure that every champion in the game is somebody's favorite. I'm sure that every player has ranked up some champion for one reason or another. And just because I do not necessarily value that champion as highly as you do, it does not immediately invalidate my point. For example, that I'm sure are people who think that Deadpool X-Force buff is awesome. I ranked at Deadpool X-Force, he's cool, I'm running him, but that's an individual example. Here we are talking more about kind of like broad, wide-scale player attention, because those are the facts here, because all of the champions in the game are competing for our attention, and ultimately the better champions are the ones who are getting more of it from more players. Therefore they are getting more exposure, they are getting more coverage, they're getting more use, they're getting ranked more frequently. So that is ultimately the baseline, whether or how successful these buffs have been. If a champion is basically nowhere to be seen, well, then that buff has failed. If a champion is seen everywhere, that buff has been very successful. Right, so let's jump to it straight away, and the worst buff of this year. And it is also worth mentioning before we go any further that I need to put my camera back on, which we have done now. But it is worth pointing out that 2022 has been abysmally bad year in terms of buffs, also largely by their quality and definitely by their quantity. We have had 10 buffed champions this year, if we do not count Guillotine, because they gave 1% increase in Guillotine's regeneration rate for a buff that they did in 2021. So I'm not counting Guillotine in this list of buffs. That means we have gotten 10 buffs. In 2022, we got 31. So last year, we got 3 times as many buffs as we did this year. And one would think, as Kabam pointed out themselves, that would significantly improve the quality of these buffs. But that also is not quite correct. Most of these buffs in 2022 would be towards the very, very bottom of a buffed champion rankings overall, comparatively speaking, with 2021. There are a couple of buffs that are on the level with the best of 2021 buffs, but virtually all of them. So even buff that will be, let's say, mediocre this year, last year it would be considered as one of the weaker buffs. So that is quite unfortunate. But I don't think that any champion exemplify a failed buff better than Psychoman. Now, Psychoman as a champion is very interesting. He really is. There's a lot of AI manipulation, tons of abilities, tons of potential. However, upon the release, we quickly realized that there is a major problem with Psychoman, and that ultimately is his damage, or more specifically, the fact that you can have a somewhat decent damage if you forego virtually all of his utility, or you have good amount of utility but absolutely abysmal damage. And the buff that Psychoman got changed absolutely nothing. They, I believe, increased the duration of his furies for a couple of seconds and tiny bits here and there, but effectively, Psycho Man was one of the, if not the worst champion released in 2021, and he still is, and he's still just as bad. Again, there are people who like Psycho Man, and that's fine. Psycho Man can do many amazing things, but again, Psycho Man, in my opinion, is the definition of a champion where if you have a better option, you will always use a better option, because they will be easier to play, will have higher damage output, so on and so forth. I'm not saying you can't do anything with Psycho Man. What I am saying is that Psycho Man as a champion was definitely not a success, and even more so, Psycho Man as a buff was just as big, if not bigger, failure. And that is the face of failure in MCOC. This champion exemplifies failure. Not to be too harsh on whoever worked on him, I'm sure they had great intentions in mind, but he sucks. That's the end of the story. Psycho Man is the worst buff of 2022 and one of the worst champions of 2021. Moving on, spot number 9, and it's another champion that kind of broke our hearts a bit. It's Deadpool X-Force. For a long time, we wanted Deadpool X-Force buff to come. We expected it. We thought, it would be cool to have a good kind of like readily available Deadpool, because most of the Deadpool champions are like exclusive or trophy champs and so on and so forth. And they did a lot of work with his animations, but it's all for naught, because nobody cares about Deadpool. He's not being used in any type of content. They gave him cooler special attack animations, but somehow, for whatever reason, they made his special attacks absolutely weak and pointless, to a point where you don't actually want to use his special 1 and 2 with his fancy new animations, because his playstyle is basically heavy level 3. And because of the new playstyle, he might have a slightly higher damage per hit, but with all the dancing around that you have to do, he's basically doing as little or even less damage than before the buff. And that's bad, because even before the buff, he was not the hardest hitting champion. Now, one kind of like gimmick that Deadpool here has is that he can spam taunt debuffs on the opponent, thus making himself much tankier. But that's all it is if it's packed with a champion that's this weak, this unremarkable. It's just kind of like a gimmick. It's one cool thing that he can do. He can become extremely tanky. But who cares? Like, he's just not a good champion. And that's definitely... I cannot believe Kabam walked into this fail. It's kind of like stepping on a rake. They made animation changes. They made him look exciting. They made him look shiny. And then they also made sure that players will pretty much never see it, enjoy or experience it, because they made the most tedious, annoying rotation for the character. Basically, you want to drop a heavy attack and then play chicken with your opponent for how long you can not press block, but start walking towards your opponent, and then drop a level 3, which animation they didn't change, and kind of like rinse and repeat. It's a very sad situation, but I think for quite a few people, from what I have heard, they'd actually prefer. Like, Deadpool X-Force was not a great champion, or a good champion, or even a mediocre champion. He was a bad champion. But I think more people would actually prefer the old Deadpool X-Force to the new one, because this tedious playstyle just furthers people from wanting to use this champion for virtually anything. So, unfortunately, here we are. Definitely a huge buff fail. Spot number 8. Torjane Foster, another champion that has been in the game forever. Buff came as a pleasant surprise. We had plenty of expectations. And unlike with the previous champions, here I can kind of understand the hesitance with going overboard with her kit, because stun loop is extremely dangerous in virtually every game. And a champion that can inflict stun loop in specific situations, you need to be careful to limit those situations. It's kind of like, we have Ronin, but there are ways around it. If they made her much kind of more effective at what she does, that could be a legitimate worry, that she could just go YOLO and try and stun loop pretty much all the time everywhere. But at the same time, the changes that they made to her are just not enough. And that is another point worth discussing, where you might have a good premise for a champion buff, you might have a decent level of execution of it, but these champions exist in competition with one another. And I personally strongly believe that reasoning line of, if player X doesn't have any of the good mystics, then you can use Thor Jane Foster in order to beat this piece of content or something. But life doesn't work that way. Game doesn't work that way. If player X doesn't have any of those 18 mystics that are better, he's still not going to want to commit or invest in Thor Jane Foster. What he will want to do is try his best to acquire those mystics that are better than Thor Jane Foster. So all that argumentation line with the champions that get buff is like, yeah, of course they're not as broken as like these top champions, but you know, in case you don't have anything at all. In most cases, if you don't have anything at all, players just try to acquire that which they are missing, rather than invest valuable catalysts and rank up materials in subpar champions, knowing that they are subpar champions, in order to try and kind of beat a single piece of content. And I think that is kind of like a problem with a lot of these buff champions, where a lot of devs and champion designers, I believe, follow the ideas like, we don't need to make these champions like really good, we just need to make them okay, but it just doesn't work. You need to make champion good at something or appealing at something, because the best champions get all the shine and mediocre champions get left behind. And Thor Jane Foster ultimately is that. She has some stagger. Okay, cool. There are plenty of other champions with stagger. She has, you know, some shock immunity now, or pseudo immunity, has some effect, but it's just nowhere near good enough. So Thor Jane Foster, still a dot. It's a failed buff. And much of what I discussed with this buff definitely is exemplified with Yondu as well. Now, yes, Yondu does have a neat heal block. It's cool. And he can eat up promise effects. But we're getting more and more tech champions that can do that. And Yondu is definitely the worst one of them. And I again, the only defense here I have heard for Yondu has been like, well, if you don't have a Nimrod and a Monkey Sentinel and this champion and that champion and this champion and that champion, well, then Yondu can do that fight. But players don't work that way. So Yondu is in spot number 7, 7th worst buff, or 7th best buff in this case, because he's just not good enough. What he does is useful. What he does can help. But he as a champion, as a complete package, is just not good enough for anybody with a sober mind to recommend you, yes, Yondu will clear you through this. Act 6, invest your catalyst in Yondu. No. What people will end up doing anyways is they're either going to find ways to push through without Yondu, even if they need to use less than optimal counters that are overall better champions, or wait till they get a better counter. And that's the right thing to do. You shouldn't be eager to rank up shit just because you don't have any better option. And that's kind of like where Yondu is at the moment. When his buff got announced, I thought there is a bit of potential with his level 2 Fury now lasting for a longer time and not just giving attack bonus. But ultimately, that being based on a ramp up and only benefiting you more in longer fights, on top of a relatively short duration there. 14 seconds is not that long to take full advantage of. And again, having that ramp up element just again makes him a bit too slow, just not quite good enough in most situations. And the rest of the kit again suffers from the idea of, you can go for level 2 and do, moderately okay damage, or if you want to access this hyped heal block that people touted him for instance on his level 1, well, you still need to sacrifice the damage because you don't have access to that level 2 Fury. So ultimately, it's just another champion where whatever he got just was not good enough, was not strong enough, and he's not good enough as a champion for me to virtually ever recommend invest any of their own catalyst into this champion. Now again, if you do like the champion, again, you can get things done. Like, you can use him into like prowess or armor up heavy matchups, and I'm sure that, you know, he's going to be capable of tackling some fights that require his specific abilities. But ultimately, is he a champion that you would recommend anybody else rank? For vast majority of the players, the answer is no. Is he a champion you're going to see in Alliance Wars, in Alliance Quests, in Battlegrounds? No. And if a champion is not good enough to appear in any of the competitive modes, then I'd argue that that champion is, you know, just not good enough as a champion, or the buff is not good enough. So Yondu is there. And next buff is a bit tricky. The next buff I did not know where to place, but I'm going to place Ant-Man as spot number 6 at the moment. I fully believe Ant-Man is better than this. The problem with Ant-Man, and his kit got more extensive makeover. It is very well possible that I will rank up Ant-Man much higher half a year from now. I am absolutely open to that possibility. But the problem with Ant-Man is, again, whether he has content home. Is there anything at all in the game you would prefer to use Ant-Man for? And so far, the answer has been no. You don't see Ant-Man in high-tier Alliance Wars as a mainstay. Maybe somebody has brought him in somewhere. You don't see him being used in Alliance Quest. It's not used for Battlegrounds offensively or defensively. In fact, pre-buff version was tankier defender than he is right now. And ultimately, is he the type of champion you want to take with your day-to-day questing? And the answer there is, yet again, just no, because of the way he's built. This game heavily punishes ramp-up champions with immediately cutting their chances of being mainstream popular daily driver champions significantly. There are some instances where ramp-up champions, when designed properly, can function extremely well and be extremely popular. For instance, Hercules is an example of a ramp-up champion. But the difference with Hercules is not only the fact that he can achieve his full ramp-up within a single fight, it's also the fact that he carries that ramp-up throughout the rest of the quest, and the fact that obviously there is plenty of other redeeming qualities. In case like Ant-Man, Ant-Man is effectively a ramp-up champion that ramps up in the fight. But that ramp-up is tricky, it's finicky, it's not straightforward as Hercules, because with Hercules, for instance, you can just do what you would normally do, maybe slightly alter, get some more intercepts, get some more heavies, and you'll be fine, you're going to ramp up. With Ant-Man, you need to execute these very specific commands. You need to know when you need to dex, when you need to drop your level 1s and heavy attacks and special 2s. And all that can amount for decently good damage. The problem is the combination of the fact that his ramp-up does require upkeep. There's a lot of timer watching, and timer watching immediately becomes significantly difficult in any meaningful and hard fights. And also the fact that it does require you to drop several bars of power in your ramp-up, which automatically means he's going to be relatively slow in virtually every fight. And then obviously none of that progress gets carried throughout the quest or other fights, which ultimately means he's likely going to have a very, very hard time ever to find kind of like a mainstream stable use. And that's a shame, because he does have a good kit. He really, truly does have quite a lot of useful abilities, starting with his buff immunity and also immunity to poison and shocks now, and a whole bunch of other things. It just was not pieced together as an effective champion for current things that we need in-game. Now, this is one of those things that can change depending on what type of content is released, just like many champions experienced their revival or revitalization because of Battlegrounds as a game mode. A lot of, nuke options such as Hitmonkey and Stark in Hand Spider-Man and Stealth Suit Spider-Man, a whole bunch of champions all of a sudden got way, way more popular than it used to be. With the release of some different sets of content, Ant-Man might see some increase with some specific Alliance war nodes, or with some specific additions to the game. Ant-Man could potentially be, recognized as a good, successful buff. But at the moment, he's not. Because ultimately it doesn't matter how many abilities a champion has or what he can do if nobody finds that champion worth using or investing or utilizing or benefiting from. So this is another situation of a buff that's, you know, nice, good on paper, but because of all the technicalities and circumstances coming together, it just doesn't work well enough. It's not effective or fast enough for people to actively invest in him. At the same time, I do believe you can do a lot of cool things with Ant-Man, and there are a lot of crazy hard finds that you can probably get through with Ant-Man. The problem is nobody wants to do them with Ant-Man. They're going to find different options because they're going to be less stressful, faster, or easier. Speaking of that, we need to discuss spots 5, 4, and 3 together. And I want to talk about all of these at the same time, so I'm going to quickly reveal spots 5, 4, and 3. So 5 is Gamora, 4 is Rocket, and 3 is Storm. And these champions are nearly identical in their buff structure or their champion builds, kind of. All of them are relatively light on utility. Rocket, I suppose, has more, but they are very high damage output champions that are glass cannony, that are fairly straightforward to play, and that's kind of like their main appeal. Gamora now ramps up quicker, Storm can do some crazy damage and there are some crazy interactions, and Rocket as well is, you know, a glass cannon by definition since birth. And all of them have seen some use in several different tiers. And therefore, by definition, I cannot call them, you know, failed buffs like I did before. So I do think that from spot onwards, these buffs are not failed. I do think that they are more or less carrying out what they were intended, and what they were intended for is needed, and players do use them. We can see Gamora being used in questing teams or in Battlegrounds deck. Rocket's buff now is very new, very recent. I do think we will see more of him. I occasionally drop in Rocket in my deck for testing in different metas as well, because that power control is quite useful. The problem with Rocket is the fact that he is the flimsiest one of the 3 that we're talking about here, and even when you don't get hit, you still end up losing like 10 or 15% of your health, which often is the reason why I still end up taking him out of my deck. And then we have Storm, which I do think is the better incorporated buff, because we do see Storm do some crazy, amazing things in specific situations. Obviously, there is the capability of you synergizing your Storm and modifying her abilities most via her Storm Pyramid X synergy, via Apox pre-fight, and then benefiting from a ton of nodes that have something to do with bleed or energy adoption or things like that, and you can get some really ridiculous results with Storm, which is largely the reason why I put her slightly ahead of the other 2, and that is because it's a mutant. There's comes tons of customization, and that also is because I personally have seen and used Storm in stuff like Heavy Q, in story content, things like that, where she can do some extraordinarily amazing things. But ultimately, all 3 of these champions are kind of like a bare minimum successful buff, where they gave them a lot of damage, relatively light on utility, so pending circumstances, both or all 3 of these champions can work what they have been buffed for. And I do think that Rocket has the most future potential, which is the reason why I didn't place him above the Storm, because he's still quite new. We still haven't seen all of what his buff can do, and he definitely has seen overall less use, less play in relevant content than Storm has to date, which again largely has to do with the fact that Storm has been buffed for longer and we have had the chance to see what she does more. And that does matter, because we do see Storm in relatively high tier Battlegrounds decks, depending on the metas and things like that, and in different kind of like pieces of game as well. So I do think all 3 of these are very, very close. You can argue for each one of them being ahead of the other one. Again, as I said, Rocket having the most utility, but also being the most squishy one. Storm having, you know, the craziest potential, I would argue, especially if you synergize her up or team up her up with some different champions, but also how compatible she has been with different metas and nodes. And then Gamora about, you know, her straightforward access, just a brute damage, plenty of buffs and things like that. So you can argue for any one of these 3 champions being 5th, 4th, or 3rd, in my opinion. But as I said, that is still the bare minimum that in my head is required for these buffs to be called relatively successful buffs. Because they are getting some use, they are getting some daytime, they are getting some catalysts, people rank them, people run them here and there. So that is why, ultimately they have achieved what they set out to do. Now, the second best buff is going to be Mordo. And the thing with Mordo is actually not as straightforward, because realistically, if we would be talking about the difference of how bad the champion was pre-buff and how good the champion is post-buff, Mordo would not be as high, because he did not receive that big of a change. What many people don't realize is ultimately Mordo that we have right now is very, very, very similar to the Mordo that we used to have. They made just enough changes for him to be better with the, longer Furies, more Furies, few extra abilities, things like that. But it virtually didn't change any of his good or bad matchups. It just slightly improved how well we can, and how well we can use him offensively. And to a point where Mordo now is like a legitimate rank 4 Mystic candidate. We do see Mordo in Battlegrounds decks used offensively and defensively. He's obviously a defensive staple, pretty much always has been. Now people are waking up to the power of Mordo's level 2 and how much damage that can do. Also just the ability to gain a ton of Fury buffs or spam the level 3s, ease of access to his level 1 power gain and level 1 spam. He's no hero of the Mystic class, let me put it like that. I don't think he's like one of the top Mystic champions in the game. But he is good enough for him to be a valuable rank up for plenty of players. He's good enough for him to be used in the most competitive game modes and competitive scenarios. And that is, again, what matters in determining whether buff is good. Do we see him being used? Yes, plenty. Can he, do some interesting, cool, tricky things? Yes. Is there something unique that he can potentially do better than others? Also, yes. Because one of the coolest things about Mordo is that he can heavily punish opponents for having buffs without actually having to get rid of them or nullifying them. And then on top of that level 1 spam and some of the other things that he's been gifted with ease of access to his power gain and so on and so forth. So, I do think that Mordo's buff was ultimately a success. Took a bit of while to set in and people to recognize it, but Mordo is a legitimately full-fledged upper echelon competitive quality champion now in the game. And that's where we are going to leave it. Now, the final buff is Juggernaut. Now, you can call me biased as much as you want for this, but Juggernaut is awesome. I was extremely critical about the weaknesses of Juggernaut initially, and it definitely took a while for me to recognize his potential, which is also why I absolutely have no doubt that, in future, some of the buffs that I currently am critical about might end up working out better. Namely, I want to pay attention to Ant-Man, because I do think Ant-Man has plenty in his kit. It just needs to be brought out in right situation. And Juggernaut got his right situation. Juggernaut is basically made for Battlegrounds. He answers a ton of crazy hard fights, and most impressively, for Battlegrounds fight length, fight size, he has one of the best damage outputs. And I think he has the best seal of approval for a successful buff out of every single champion that's mentioned here. To a point where I have 27 rank 4 champions, most of them in my deck at any given meta in Battlegrounds. And he's arguably the most banned champion in my account. And that is for a good reason, because he destroys Korgs, Killmongers, Dooms, Nick Furies, Hulkling. He just plows through things. Yes, he's not the most utility-heavy champion. Large portion of his value does stem from his damage. but also having access to basically permanent unstoppable, and also having access to nullify when he's awakened. All of those things do help him to give him just enough utility on top of this monstrous damage for him to be amazing, crazy, and bonkers. Arguably one of my favorite champions right now, and by far the biggest success story of 2022 buffed champions. And recently, since I did end up taking my Juggernaut all the way to rank 4, I have been using him in more and more content, and he's even one of my favorite kind of like daily questing champions. Because guess what? I realized that using Juggernaut in daily quests is pretty much faster and easier than it is, let's say, with CGR when I have to clear a random lane somewhere, because I don't need to worry about exactly how I finish my combos. I have the unstoppable, so I can get super easy intercepts. I don't need to keep an eye on my judgments, and he does those fights just as fast in vast majority of the cases. His fight finishing speed is just something special. So here we are. Juggernaut, ultimately, in my opinion, is the best buffed 22 champion. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what you guys think about my rankings. Before I go, I can show you here them quickly written up as they were in order. So Juggernaut, number 1, Mordo, 3, 4, 5. Again, as I said, you can argue however you want to place them, but I think I explained myself quite well that I think Stormrocket and Gamora are very, very similar in terms of their usage, in terms of their popularity, in terms of where and what they can do, how they do things in the game. And then we have Ant-Man, who has potential more so than, you know, pretty much any other champion in this list. He just doesn't have a home or purpose. And then we have the bigger fails of Yondu, TJF, DPX, and Psycho Man. So, that is it for today's video. Let me know what you guys think, and I will catch you guys soon. See ya. Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So, we have all the information about the